Certainly the most important public policy question of the last 10 years, maybe more if you go back to the war on terrorism. And the question is, did we get it right? In fact, the real question is, are we even properly grappling with the question? We're talking about the response to COVID, and a new book lays out the argument that, well, I'll give you the title and subtitle, and I'll tell you where the authors are coming from. In COVID's wake, how our politics failed us. Princeton professors Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee combined on this book. The origin was from an idea about saying things that maybe the Academy should start saying that they've been a little shy to say. And this is an extremely important development in just discourse in general, but specifically a reexamination of our COVID policies. Professor Macedo and Lee, welcome to The Gist.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'll let you determine which one of you answers, but we'll just start off by laying the predicate. And your claim is that the non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, just flat out didn't work. The lockdowns didn't work. The mask mandate didn't work. I don't know if there are any slight ones that you think were better than not, but can you explain to perhaps a skeptical audience this idea that all that we did and all that we suffered for was for naught?
Do we want to start with the pre-COVID pandemic plans and what they said about these measures? Or do you want to start with?
We can, or we could just summarize that by saying they anticipated a huge respiratory infection and in general said nothing will work. That was the state of the intellectual examination of this issue before it actually happened, right?
They said that the evidence in support of the effectiveness or efficacy of each of these measures was poor, that they were of uncertain efficacy. They went through all of them individually, the masking, the school closures, the social distancing measures, border closures, contact tracing, and the other measures, everything before the vaccines and aside from drugs. And they were assessed, these measures were assessed in multiple pre-COVID pandemic plans. And in every instance, the evidence supporting their efficacy was rated weak. And it was also predicted the costs would be certain and considerable. So those are the messages coming out of the pre-COVID pandemic planning documents.
And so why do we say, though, that when that theory was put into practice, why do you claim the theory was actually borne out, that it didn't work?
Well, there's no evidence that it worked. Let's put it that way. My colleague Frances is the empiricist in the group here, and she's looked at the evidence from the 50 states, the CDC data across the 50 states, which varied widely in the length and stringency of the lockdowns. There's very strong partisan effect. Democratic states stayed closed longer than Republican states, and we just don't see payoff in terms of morbidity or deaths from COVID in those states that had the longer school closures, the longer lockdowns, and the more stringent application of these measures overall. We have good information on what the state policies were. We have CDC data on deaths before the vaccines and after the vaccines. And we find that after the vaccines, Republican death rates diverge from the Democratic states. They go up because of vaccine hesitancy. So it's not like we don't have any information about anything.
Right, because if you look at it is true. If people are saying, wait a minute, I just looked at the stats and red states did have worse death tolls per million, 100,000 than blue states, that is post-vaccine, and that's a relic of vaccine uptake.
I mean, the data are consistent with that interpretation, that we see the red states and blue states diverge in their COVID outcomes after vaccines became available, but not before. And you had the better part of a year, basically from March until the end of December 2020, before vaccines were available at all, where red states and blue states pursued different policies. And yet at the end of that, there's just not a difference in their outcomes. That was evident in the summer of 2020 when it became clear that the speed with which states had locked down had not had an evident effect. And I was sort of surprised that there was so little of attention to that fact at that point, because there were a lot of predictions in the news in the lead up to the issuing of those stay-at-home orders, that every day that governors delayed in issuing those orders would have a negative effect on the outcomes, and yet at the end of the summer, those predictions that were based on mathematical models, those predictions were just not borne out in the data.
So it's very important. You used the phrase, you mentioned cost-benefit analysis, risk-harm analysis. What you're not saying, I mean, you're saying this, but you're not saying on net it wasn't worth it. You're going way beyond that and just citing the data and saying there was no effect. There is no discernible empirical effect of having done lockdowns for 4 months or lockdowns versus 2 months, of having mask mandates or no mask mandates, of having the schools closed for a lengthy amount of time or having the schools open. No difference.
That's what the data show, that we don't see a difference based on the variation in the types of non-pharmaceutical interventions that states implemented. The non-pharmaceutical interventions mean all of the different types of physical measures that are used to keep people apart and to try to prevent the spread of disease. That states varied in their use of those policies, and yet at the end of that time period, when the vaccines began to be rolled out, we don't see a difference in outcomes. Now, we can't say based on that we know for certain that these policies don't work. All we can say with confidence is that there's a lack of evidence that they do work.
Right. So why is it that in other societies, G20 countries, European countries, even Canada, death tolls per whatever your denominator is were lower, much lower? Canada, about half as much as ours. I shan't touch Sweden just yet, but Germany, UK didn't do great, but Germany, France, all throughout Europe, lower than ours. And they did have interventions. They did have non-pharmaceutical interventions. I know their schools were actually open more than ours were, but there seems to be some difference, and it's not genetic. It would seem to, and it couldn't have been that the vaccines got there sooner or more quickly. What explains that difference?
Well, a lot of the difference between the U.S. and other advanced democracies happens in the second year, in the year after the vaccines were rolled out. So you have to compare the first year and the second year separately. So that's something to keep in mind. That second year mattered a lot. Now, we cite in the book, but don't discuss at length, another paper that came out in 2024 in the Lancet Regional Health Europe, which looks at the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions across the 29 countries in Europe. And they find no relationship between the stringency of the restrictions that were adopted and COVID outcomes in Europe. And they look separately at 2020, 2021, and 2022. And there was wide variation with, Sweden, as you mentioned, which never had a lockdown, or Switzerland, which only had one lockdown, and many countries that had 3 or even more lockdowns. And yet there's no relationship there. They do find, like we find, a relationship between vaccine uptake across European countries and excess mortality. But they don't find a relationship between the use of these restrictions and the outcomes.
Now, you mentioned the risk-benefit analysis. There was a dearth of talking about risk. The benefit would be supposedly lives saved, and that became not just the North Star, that became the end-all, be-all. Who is responsible? Whose fault? I'll use the word fault. Whose fault was it that we just ignored the risk part of the risk-benefit analysis while we were going through it?
Well, I think we could say that many people bear some responsibility for that. I mean, one other thing that these pre-COVID pandemic plans warned about, aside from the lack of evidence for the efficacy of these measures and the certainty of the costs, was the fact that in a time of crisis, pandemic crisis, political leaders might be tempted to use these measures to show that they were getting tough, to show that they were in charge, to show that they were doing something dramatic.
Or just doing something, which is very important in politics.
Yes, absolutely. And
be there during the snowstorm or you'll be elected out of office, every Northeast mayor knows.
Right. So this is a snowstorm on steroids, and political leaders felt the need to do something. They also saw other states. Italy instituted the first national lockdown, and then it spread from there. But those pre-COVID pandemic measures acknowledged this, and then insisted that public health officials needed to have the responsibility of informing political leaders and the public of the uncertainty of the evidence for the efficacy of these measures, and the certainty, really, that these measures would be extremely costly. They were pointed out over and over. And so public health officials certainly should have been more vocal about the costs that were bound to follow. There was plenty of evidence for this in March 2020. We just talked to a colleague up at Harvard who had himself written an article on school closures.
Is that Graham Allison?
No, it was. That's a good guess, though. It's Paul Peterson, who's editor of Education Next, and who wrote an article very early on, pointing out that based on our knowledge of snow days previously, but also teacher strikes, that there was good evidence for the big negative consequences of school closures for children's learning, but also for parents who had to stay home with them and other kinds of effects.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but there were governors who were arguing, look, we go out for 2 weeks for spring break and nothing bad happens. But actually, that's wrong. And it should be taken in stride or taken in conjunction with the entire risk and benefit picture.
Yes, and closing for 2 weeks wasn't going to do a whole heck of a lot of good, given the grounds for knowing that the virus had circulated pretty widely in society at that point. There were skeptics about these measures who pointed out in the middle of March 2020 that we've got people just following each other off the edge of a cliff here with these school closures and lockdowns because they're not thinking ahead.
You mean elected officials falling off a cliff?
There was elected officials, decision makers falling each other off the head of a cliff, by engaging in these lockdowns. Because what happens after you close down for 2 weeks? The virus is still there. When you release the clamp, the virus will still be there circulating, and will break out again. So in the first instance, public health leaders should have been involved, but it's governors and other political leaders are responsible for taking account of everything that's related to or part of the public good when enacting these kinds of measures. They should have taken broader responsibility for thinking about the costs as well as the benefits. I think it was certainly part of governors and local officials who were making decisions should have thought the public good broadly.
Epidemiologists, public health officials, public health experts are not public commerce experts or public economy experts. They will tell you, and Fauci did tell you, or are they, or should be? Or should they be? Because there are many I read a lot of public health papers where they talk about, say, the cumulative effect of a recession. Economists will also opine, but here's the effect of a recession. Here's the effect of lifelong earning. Here's the effect of, health outcomes if you don't have sufficient income. So that is my question. Were public health officials abandoning part of their remit, or is it more on the elected official to know that they're never going to tell us that the economy is something to keep an eye on?
Well, public health should be broadly construed, as in all the things that affect the health of the public. And we know that there are social determinants of health. Among those are education, employment, the state of the economy, the state of your connectedness or social ties. All of those things affect your health. So broadly understood, public health ought to take all those things into account. But that isn't what happened during the pandemic, and public health officials are quite frank about that they were focused on the spread of this one pathogen and its effects on public health. So it was a tunnel vision around COVID. And then the policy advisory groups that were formed to provide information to elected officials were made up of epidemiologists, virologists, public health folks who were focused just on COVID, and then generalist government officials. So there were not experts who knew things about education or the effects of the economy, or there were just no broader perspectives being brought to bear. It was this disease and how it might be slowed And those were the only considerations that were being brought to bear.
Yeah. So the analogy is, and you use it in your book, generals in a war. In fact, the public health community saw themselves as in a war, and much of laptop America, which is one of your delightful phrases about the kind of knowledge workers that made the calls here, they were involved in this war, this analogous war on COVID. But when we think about generals in a real war, when we think about politicians, there is always going to be that kind of general, and it's subsided a bit, post-Vietnam. But Curtis LeMay bombs away LeMay, or the General Ripper from Dr. Strangelove, the general who insists we got to go in there and we got to kill everyone, and the only factor that we use in our determination is defeating the enemy. And what we hope is that our elected officials, the civilian representatives of the public, have and weigh other competing interests. But that did not happen. This is what we were just talking about. That did not happen here. And do you think that there are all these reasons why, and there is a bias towards action, but do you think there was something else going on, something else related to the culture of the kind of people who were making these decisions?
Well, I mean, as you said, epidemiologists are experts on epidemiology and disease. I mean, that's part of it. Though, as Francis said, social determinants of health is a central part of public health, and that should have been brought to bear as well. I mean, 2020 was an election year in the United States. I think one other thing that happened was that reopening the economy rhetorically got associated with the Republican Party over the summer of 2020 in particular, and Democrats were less willing, I think, to attend to concerns being expressed by Republicans and policies being embraced to a greater extent by Republicans because of the deep polarization of our society. So dissent was coded as coming from the other side of the political spectrum, and I think it tended to be discounted for that reason. So the politics of it definitely played a role. President Trump being on the ballot in the fall of 2020 probably played a role in making these divisions especially hard, deep. But on the other hand, once he lost the election, things didn't really change dramatically. There was still an unwillingness to listen and consider the costs on the part of many progressive states. I mean, we do think you're absolutely right about the wartime metaphors. We found that those were quite prevalent in April 2020, after a period in March where there was some dissent by experts and major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. As we moved into April 2020 and into May, wartime metaphors were used more and more. And the kind of rhetoric that was used was we need vital unity, that universities, the public health profession, media, journalists and so on all need to be on the same page. We need to be working with government, and we need to be reinforcing the strategy that we have adopted. And the sense was, we think at that point, that people became intolerant of dissent. That there needed to be vital unity was a phrase used by a center up at Harvard in its national COVID plan, and dissenters were seen as risking lives by discouraging people from complying with the chosen strategy, and that was unhelpful.
Yeah. And let me also add that polarized, deeply polarized, the phrase you used, and I would also add to that the associated trend of the United States that we are a low trust society and beginning to become more low trust. So when you have, to take one example, Donald Trump tweeting in probably not only the least helpful, but the most incendiary way, end the lockdowns now and free Michigan, the result is not anyone's mind gets open. They say, maybe we should free Michigan. The result is one side of the political aisle is activated. And how that shows up is a bunch of militia members show up with guns and line the gallery of the Michigan legislature. You couldn't design, I think, you tell me, I don't think you could design worse messaging even for the side of let us get rid of the lockdowns. Or am I just overly focusing on Trump? Were there a lot of very reasonable public officials actually in public getting an airing of the weighing of pros and cons?
No, politicians tend to shy away from acknowledging trade-offs, where, this is a hard choice, but on balance, we think, this course of action is superior to this other course of action. This kind of rhetoric, that's difficult to walk people through.
I think Mike DeWine did it a little. I think Andrew Cuomo, weirdly, he'd like to at least explain his thinking. So maybe there are some anti-Trump examples. Sorry to interrupt.
Cuomo actually said that the only thing that mattered was saving lives.
Yes.
That, everything else, would take a back seat to, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's people losing their jobs and not getting their unemployment, whatever it was, all of that took a back seat to saving a life. And if everything we did, he said, saves one life, it will have been worth it.
Yeah, he talked about, but what I'm saying is he talked about the sacrifices we had to make. So there is an inherent trade-off in that, trying to convince people or decree to people that you are being asked to make a sacrifice, but this is why the sacrifice is worth it. Anyway, maybe I'm working overboard to try to excuse Andrew Cuomo.
What I would say is that the initial closures were very popular. And they were popular across party lines. Polling in the middle of March 2020 showed that 87% of Americans approved of the broad-ranging closures that were being implemented. So initially, I think the public was very inclined to accept that, on the one hand, you had the economy, on the other hand, you had lives, and lives mattered more, and so that they could think in those terms. And so that framing, I think, carried forward for a long time until people began to feel the effects that the closures were involving for society. Even then, though, as red state governors began to reopen in the summer of 2020, they didn't say, "Well, we're reopening because we need to prioritize the economy over lives." That's not what they said. What they instead would say is that we're reopening safely. That they just tried to reassure people that it was safe to reopen, rather than trying to get into, trying to make the case that that in the balance between the economy and lives, we should give the economy more priority. That was not the kind of rhetoric that they were using.
No, that's probably smart, though. I mean, America was freaked out, so you have to do a little hand-holding.
I think Governor DeSantis did invite in some experts who, some of whom we discuss in the book, the eventual signers of this thing called the Great Barrington Declaration, and they emphasize the costs of these closure measures and the very variable vulnerability to people from COVID in the population, and that did lead him to insist on Florida schools, or that among other things led to him insisting that Florida schools be reopened in the fall. So, he had an elderly population. He might have suffered politically if that had not been a good call, but. He did invite in these experts, and he did follow their advice for whatever combination of reasons.
Yeah, and the Florida death toll versus the California death toll or death rate was what?
Florida did fine. I mean, Florida did a bit better in some ways once you adjust for, of course, both elderly population, but adjust for age and various background factors. So Florida did just fine. Again, according to the numbers that we have, the CDC data by state. So
we were talking about some discussion within academia, especially early on, if this was the right call. There was some debate, there were some papers, but those papers got less and less attention. The debate got more and more muted. You tell me if on Princeton campus or virtually they had a lot of teach-ins debating whether these measures should be taken. In your book, you talk a lot about how there was just a flattening of dissent or discussion or debate. What do you think the mechanisms of that were? How did that come to pass that my profession, journalism, you usually get some credibility and excitement if you could offer a point of view that isn't offered if it's backed up by facts. In academia, your profession, that's a way to establish yourself if you can show something that the rest of the field has missed. But that wasn't going on with COVID. Why not?
I mean, we spend more time in the book describing what happened than describing the motives or the causes. Frankly, I think we both feel that there's a lot we don't understand. And I think the extent of compliance here, again, there's the partisanship. I think it's not just that most academics are Democrats. It's also that they're members of, educated elite class the phrase that was used, the slogan that was used, to follow the science or trust the science. Members of educated elites are liable to be the ones who are trustful of science and trustful of scientific authorities. I mean, if it comes down to Anthony Fauci versus Donald Trump, your average professor is going to not to have a difficult time deciding which they're going to go with.
That's true, but let me interrupt. You cited scientists. First of all, before the pandemic, it was scientists who were saying what should happen and how these interventions wouldn't work. Scientists. And you cited scientists. I said, you said Peterson, I said Allison. They were out there. So it's not as if, Fauci has a major prominent role, but it's not as if there weren't scientists to choose from as opposed to Trump. It's just that those scientists weren't retweeted or held up or passed around as an interesting example.
There was a dearth of dissent beginning in the summer of 2020. Like, it really died out. Like, after the whole of government, whole of society strategy was adopted in the spring of 2020, you really don't see much departing from that, from public health, from scientists. Now, part of that, newspapers were maintaining an editorial line. There was also suppression of dissenting perspectives on social media. So some of this was imposed, but I also think there was a great deal of just pure deference to authority on the part of educated elites in all these what we call truth-seeking professions, science, journalism, academia, that you just...
And think tanks, think tanks that weren't even left aligned. Rockefeller, which is left aligned, used to never make proclamations, but they did. But so did AEI, which is, generally libertarian. So did Niskanen, which prides itself on being very centrist. They were all in favor of lockdowns and these NPIs.
We're astonished, frankly, at the amount of groupthink in retrospect. Again, this is something we describe. We don't fully understand. We come from a profession, political science, where skepticism is sort of the order of the day. As Francis has pointed out to me before, and to others we've talked to, challenging the effects of various interventions, being suspicious of evidence, until it's ironclad and been subject to rigorous criticism is kind of what social scientists do for a living. But there seem to be a lot of credulousness around these measures here, and an unwillingness to question them in public. We will say one other thing, which we've observed, and again, we don't fully understand because we're not public health scholars, but there seemed to be an especial unwillingness within the field of public health in many ways to challenge these things. We quote Sandro Galea, Dr. Sandro Galea, who was dean of the Boston University School of Public Health, and he published a book called Within Reason, which is subtitled Towards a More Liberal Public Health. It means liberal in the classical sense of being open to criticism and open to critical evidence and so on.
Yeah, in the more classical sense, but not the classical liberal sense. Oh my God, there are no phrases that really work.
Well, yeah. I think traditionally academic scientists have been liberals in that sense of openness to criticism, willingness to be self-critical. All claims are conditional, pending the discovery of more evidence and the advancing of stronger arguments. But that really did seem to wane under COVID, beginning in more or less April and May, as Francis indicated. And the extent of it is still a bit hard to understand. I mean, some of it had to do with again, China lockdown, and the World Health Organization said that's been a big success. Italy locked down as a nation, first national lockdown in the world, and the citizens accepted it. That showed that it was possible, something that was never considered really possible before. So there were many factors that contributed to the embrace of these policies, we really need to look back in retrospect and try to figure out why there wasn't more dissent. As you mentioned, Graham Allison, who's a great scholar of crisis decision making at Harvard, wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In April, it seemed maybe in partly response to some of these other national plans coming out, he said, look, we need to step back and question whether we have the right strategy here. We need a team B. We need devil's advocates. We need to draw on a much wider range of experts just to make sure that the strategy that we're doubling down on is the right strategy. There are grounds for suspecting that it's not. And we think, looking back at that document that he put out in retrospect, it seems exactly right. And yet it got no attention whatsoever. None of these major foundations or groups, think tanks and so on, picked up that suggestion, on any part of the political spectrum, really, until much later. So it's really kind of astonishing that you have those kinds of sensible interventions which just get ignored.
During the crisis, I don't know of any major conference that was convened at a think tank or a prominent university to debate the strategy around how to respond to COVID. And when you think about the scale of the response, the disruptions to society that were involved, to society, to education, to employment, to business, to human beings' connectedness to others, like the scale of the effects were just vast, and just no debate. It's a fascinating period, and I don't think we can offer a fully adequate account. One of the things that Steve and I felt throughout the whole time we were working on this book is that we're barely scratching the surface of a profound period in American politics and world politics.
And there still haven't been many academic conferences. There still is an absence of critical, remarkably. There was one out at Stanford that Dr. Bhattacharya organized that we went to, but there were various people calling for that to be closed down.
The president of Stanford gave the keynote address, and this was decried as some betrayal of the science. I watched that entire conference online, by the way.
We were
it was
there,
good and bad. I'll get to it was good. I love the fact that there's open discussion. I think that there were certain guests who I have discounted. I don't know if you have. But I want to just throw a theory out there about the nature of expertise in general, and maybe you've studied this given your professional backgrounds. When we say we defer to the science or trust the experts, each of us maybe has one or two areas of expertise. And even if, say, we are a scientist, I might be an oceanographer. Do I really have expertise in the, migratory patterns of the North American land elk, for instance? So what we basically do is develop these rough heuristics that sort of go like, I know what I know. I also know my cultural tribe on these issues that I'm pretty familiar with. I have a constellation of people that I trust. And then I see the professional affiliations, maybe the publications that run the stories by those people. And our definition of expertise is really, it becomes very attenuated and very, our heuristic is they're the experts who are aligned with the experts who are aligned with the other experts. And this can cause a problem of you could either look at it a couple ways, like if there is a deep rot in the middle of it, you're going to get bad expertise all the way down, or a little bit of a tipping point based on the culture of who decides who is an expert. And I'll throw another thing on there. This probably goes on all the time. So you're saying, why didn't it happen during a time other than COVID? I do think there is something about being in a lockdown and being under such tremendous stress that doesn't make us think to the maximum of our intellect. Well, so I'll just throw that out there. Have you thought of that, and what do you think of that?
I see so much irony in the use of the phrase "follow the science" or "trust the experts" as we look back at what happened during the pandemic. First of all, if you go back and look at the state of the science before the lockdowns were imposed, it was deeply unsettled. Like there was no evidence base that established that these measures would work. It was highly uncertain. So the science was not in a state where you could proclaim that, that best practices dictate X or Y, that wasn't present. Second, when you contemplate the scale of the society-wide and human effects of these measures, it exceeded anyone's expertise, even to get a grasp on what the effects would be on society of the kind of measures that were adopted. So, it outstrips expertise. So there's just enormous irony that the catchphrase of the day was "follow the science" when there was so little science, and the effects were so broad ranging, far beyond any scientific areas of specialization.
The thing to add to that, too, is I agree with everything Francis said. These decisions, policy decisions, like should we close churches, should we close businesses, should we close schools, they all involve value judgments as well as scientific questions. So, at a threshold matter, Francis is quite right. The science was unsettled. The evidence for the effectiveness of these measures wasn't good. Even if it had been a little better, we'd still have to weigh the values at stake in choosing these policies and shaping them. There's no scientific, way of measuring the costs of not allowing people to go to church, but that's an important part of the question. And likewise, there are consequences that can be studied of keeping kids out of school or isolating people or encouraging the social isolation. But on the other hand, there are also value judgments of how do we want to live our lives? What matters to us in life? How much risk are we willing to bear? And so follow the science, certainly the evidence was uncertain, but it also expressed a kind of impossibility given the inevitability that there were value judgments that had to be weighed as well.
Yeah. I want a lawn sign that says, in this house, we believe in risk-reward analysis, but I can't find one. What do you think of... Okay, so let's talk about Jay Bhattacharya, who is one of the founders, one of the organizers of what's called the Great Barrington Declaration, a short document that essentially in October of 2020 advised towards greater openness. As far as that goes, I think Jay Bhattacharya was right, and definitely it was worth having that discussion. On the other hand, early in the pandemic, in a Wall Street Journal editorial and elsewhere, he estimated or put forward a number of 20 to 40,000 deaths and didn't quite endorse it, but certainly was trying to let readers think that this was the likeliest outcome and therefore our intervention should be less severe. Do you look at maybe you have thoughts on that 20 to 40,000 number? Do you look at the discussion on Bhattacharya now, where it will always be, and this came out during his hearing in front of the Senate to confirm him as director of NIH? Do you think that's an unfair smear, or do you think this is an example of, yes, he did get this wrong, but if you listen to overall what he was saying, we should accept that mistake and also listen to what he's saying otherwise? Go ahead.
I think if you go back and look at that Wall Street Journal editorial,
I was reading it minutes before this conversation.
What you see is that he's putting forward a range of possibilities from low to high. And he's suggesting that the severity of the pandemic might be less than we anticipated. Now, that happened in 2009, where with the H1N1 virus, that there was a great deal of concern about it having pandemic potential. There were even advisors who recommended to President Obama to close the schools. And there was a mass vaccination campaign aimed at young people. But it turned out that virus was less threatening than seasonal flu. So you can't always tell early in a crisis, because what you see early in a crisis are the people who are really sick, who are showing up at hospitals, and who pass away at a much higher rate than the people in the broad population who were contracting the illness and only having cold or flu-like symptoms, or maybe even having no symptoms at all. And so what Bhattacharya was arguing for was the need to do a seroprevalence study. And as we look back, I don't understand why that wasn't priority number one on the part of our health agencies. Why wasn't the first thing, their first course of action, to try to ascertain just what the infection fatality rate of COVID was? But that was not a top priority. And so you wind up seeing, Bhattacharya try to take the lead on putting together a study like that in Santa Clara County, basically on a shoestring, because it was very important information that needed to be obtained, and yet there was not the kind of effort that you would expect to obtain it.
Yeah. So in that commentary, is the coronavirus as deadly as they say? Where his answer wasn't necessarily no, I'll give you that. It was, this should be the question we're asking. He does say, he talks about a true fatality rate is, let me get to the relevant part. Fear of COVID-19 is based on its high estimated case fatality rate. 2 to 4% of people with confirmed COVID-19 have died, according to the World Health Organization. So I'll stop there. What do we know the case fatality rate to be now?
I think we think it's about 0.27.
0.27.
Yeah, so it's much lower. Yeah.
It's important to distinguish between the case fatality rate and the infection fatality rate. The case fatality rate depends on your ability to ascertain cases. And if you recall, early in the pandemic, testing capabilities were very low. And so you had to be quite sick, and you needed to be in a healthcare facility to get a test early on. And so you're only testing the very sick people, and 2 to 4% of them would pass away. But that doesn't tell you what the threat is to the general population. And so that's why the seroprevalence study was needed.
Yeah, that's basically his next sentence. The true fatality rate is the portion of those infected who die, not the deaths from identified positive cases. The latter rate, what you were just saying, identified positive cases, is misleading because of bias in testing. The degree of bias is uncertain, but it could make the difference between an epidemic that kills 20,000 and one that kills 2 million. If the number of actual infections is much larger than the number of cases, orders of magnitude larger, then the true fatality rate is much lower as well. That's not only plausible, but likely based on what we know so far.
Well, and it was much lower than 2 to 4%. Yeah. It was an order of magnitude lower than 2 to 4%. It was less than 1%. The best estimate we've got right now is 0.27. So that's based on an Ioannidis study that came out in September of 2020, where he surveyed all the seroprevalence studies around the world, and the global average was at 0.27.
But he's certainly rhetorically anchoring the reader with overly low, or is that with a way too low estimate? And that's what's going on. He didn't say it could be 200,000, which is actually very much in the realm of reality.
Yeah, I reread that a few weeks ago for another event we had, and I read him as expressing uncertainty about the infection fatality rate because we didn't know the number of underlying infections in the population, and expressing the possibility of this range, as we said. And the likelihood that it was much lower than the figures were being put out at that point, which is 3.4% fatality rate from the director of the World Health Organization. And his main claim, I think, was that we have to do more studies to figure out how many people in the population have encountered the virus, have caught the virus, not become seriously ill, to determine what the infection fatality rate is. So I think that's the main point of that op-ed. That we don't know the crucial number because we haven't done a study to figure out how widely the virus has spread in the population. And Shirley was right to say that should have been a high priority on the part of the CDC and the federal government.
And it's also worth putting on the table the previous experiences we have had with overestimating the threat of a new pathogen. So there's not just the 2009 example. There's also the 1976 swine flu, where that turned out just to disappear, even though there was, this big vaccination campaign that was pressed on the American people. And those vaccines had some negative side effects, led to the firing of the director of the CDC. So there had been some policy disasters associated with big mistakes, overestimating pathogens in the memory of people who worked in public health, both 1976 and 2009. So it was a reasonable thing to suggest that we could be overreacting. We had done it before.
Yeah. Help me with this. So earlier I told you about my ideas about how we define expertise, and it's usually there's a constellation of experts, and they're sort of expertise by association. What do I do with the fact that so many of the people who were advocating for loosening lockdown restrictions or opening up society also became the same people who told me that the vaccine was unsafe, to this day talk about myocarditis rates, which, though slightly higher probably, or almost definitely not as dangerous and deadly as the as the COVID itself, which is certainly mitigated by the vaccine. So that's my question. The confluence, if we're trying to defer and identify experts, the clustering together of this unproven assertion, or I think disproved assertion, about the overall ineffectiveness and dangerous of the vaccine with what you're pointing out, which is that our mitigation efforts were for naught.
Well, I don't think there are the people that advocated who pointed out that the measures we adopted would be very costly, these non-pharmaceutical measures that we talked about. And when this Great Barrington Declaration was published in October, thousands and thousands of health professionals and scientists signed it. I don't believe those were predominantly vaccine skeptics. There were some of those. Now, there was some messaging around vaccines that was misleading. The World Health Organization changed the definition of herd immunity on its website over the summer to say that it was a concept that came from vaccination, not from vaccination plus acquiring the virus and recovering from the virus, which common epidemiology would have, of course, suggested that. But they changed the definition there in order to encourage people to get vaccinated, apparently. There was also a lot of messaging suggesting that if you got vaccinated, you'd be a dead end to the virus, that you wouldn't pass the virus on to others. There was no good ground for claiming that the sterilizing effect of the virus was not an endpoint in vaccine research. So there was no basis for claiming that. And yet that was another claim that was advanced that was misleading to people and that may have led people to feel misled. So there was some misinformation around vaccines. And I don't think that most of the people who advocated, however, or who urged that we take more seriously the costs of these non-pharmaceutical measures were vaccine skeptics. There should have been more discussion around. I mean, the recommendations on boosters in the United States has been much more widely sweeping than in European countries. Dr. Paul Offit at the University of Pennsylvania Children's Hospital has pointed this out, that we've recommended boosters in many cases for everyone over the age of 6 months, when European countries have been recommending them for everyone over the age of 65 years old. So there's some marginal issues involving vaccines that are worth discussing. But we're not vaccine skeptics. We think the vaccines were a game changer for the vulnerable. And as we pointed out before, there's good evidence that states with higher vaccination rates had lower morbidity rates after the vaccines were available.
And Paul Offit was on my show, and I give him enormous amount of credit because we ticked through the list. I presented him with things he said and predictions he made, and he would say, I got that wrong. I got that wrong. Do you think such a no, I don't want to say reckoning. Do you think such an exercise would be valuable, is even possible with many in the public health community who did get it wrong?
I think people are not going to listen to, or many people are not going to listen to public health officials if they are not prepared to acknowledge what they got right and what they got wrong. Like they need to come clean in that way, because there are many people in the public who doubt them now. I mean, you can see that in the uptake of the boosters. It's like 12%. CDC is saying everybody over 6 months should get them, and the vast majority of Americans are not. So that shows there's a lot of skepticism. So how do you get that trust back? I think you have to treat people like adults and acknowledge what you got wrong. And
do you think enough people in the public health community actually think they got things wrong, important things wrong?
I think they don't yet. They kind of circled the wagons, I think, in the polarization that occurred during the pandemic. And there wasn't a lot of self-criticism in public health, just like, there hasn't been a lot in academia or journalism for that matter, which is, those are the targets that we take on in our book, that we think that there's room for a lot of self-criticism among experts of all varieties in the wake of the COVID pandemic.
Let me give another example, which I think is also quite important. We haven't talked, and I know we don't have time to talk about the origins of the virus, but that's another topic on which discussion has been constrained, and in which there's been far too intolerance of the theory that the virus might have originated in the lab. Just in February, this past February 2025, Nature magazine published an article saying what sparked the COVID pandemic, mounting evidence points to raccoon dogs. Well, I don't think there is mounting evidence pointing to raccoon dogs. More and more international intelligence agencies have said that the virus likely originated in the lab. The French National Academy of Medicine voted 97% to 3% just a couple of weeks ago that the lab origin was much more likely. And yet Nature magazine only quotes 6 scientists in this article. All 6 scientists are well-known proponents of natural origins. They quote no one on the other side of the argument. So I think, scientists in general and science journalists need to be much more frank about mistakes that have been made, things that need to be fairly re-examined, and certainly the possibility that the virus originated from China's leading bat coronavirus research institute in Wuhan is hardly a far-fetched possibility. And let me just make one final point, one other point, which is, a premise of the attacks on science and universities is that they're politicized. If we're not willing to ask these hard questions and address these hard questions, we sort of prove that true, that we're politicized. The only way to refute that suggestion is by being willing to ask these hard questions and admit our mistakes where they've been made.
Let me ask you, without picking on an individual, someone who shows up 18 times in your book, Greg Gonzalez, who's an associate professor of epidemiology at Yale and a MacArthur fellow. And early on in the pandemic, he was cautious about restrictions and NPIs. And then he became a leading voice of lockdowns. And then years after the lockdowns were lifted, he wanted to continue the lockdowns. He wrote an op-ed in 2022, The Moral Danger of Declaring the Pandemic Over Too Soon. He criticized Dr. Lena Wen, who was very much in the mainstream of wanting lockdowns, as essentially damning thousands of people to their deaths by 2022, saying that the lockdowns should be lifted. It seems like nothing has happened to his credibility. Let's not pick on this one guy. I think he probably stands for many, many, many people. But I just saw a JAMA article where it deferred to him as the expert and asked him, why haven't we learned the right lessons of COVID? How is there ever going to be a chance for reform if people's reputation actually only grows after getting it exactly wrong?
Well, that just shows what kind of bubble academics exist in right now. If you consult a broader array of people, you would encounter folks who have a lot of questions about what was done in the pandemic but we were talking to other like-minded people in these settings in public health. And, I don't exclude, academia more generally or even political science fully from that characterization. But I think that's how we get these conversations that just sound so completely out of touch. Because, we are, and it's a very self-selected group of people who, who've wound up in these professions. And it leads to a decline of trust.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, it just leads to a decline of trust. And again, on the virus origins issue, the vast majority of the public thinks it leaked from the lab. So it's not as though everybody being on the same page, refusing to admit mistakes and so on, is convincing the public, because it's not any more than it is with the boosters being recommended for people over the age of 6 months. So why don't we try something else? Why don't we try being frank and honest with people and see if that does it better? Why don't we try behaving in a trustworthy manner and see if that restores some of the trust?
That's a good call to ethical action. What do you think? You're academics, you believe in free inquiry, but I mentioned Lena Wen. She was to speak at an American Public Health Association meeting, and there was a petition signed by hundreds and hundreds of people, self-identified members of the public health community. Hundreds of people put their name and academic affiliation on this petition, saying that she was engaged in eugenics. This was very much a mainstream, which you criticize, very much a mainstream voice on advocating for lockdowns. But by 2022, she had said, let us ease the lockdowns. What do you think should be done with those hundreds of people who self-identify and put their names and put their institutions down? Should they have no professional or any other consequence?
I mean, this is not a matter that we've contemplated. We do think that we need to investigate these matters, that those who have behaved in an intolerant manner should be ashamed of themselves. But, there are many issues out there that, including on the origins of the virus and so on, where it doesn't seem as though people have been entirely frank about what they were thinking when they were writing that it came from nature and so on and so forth. There's been an unwillingness to respond to empirical criticism of theories like a geospatial analysis of the first cases around the wet market and so on, where the authors of a leading theory that supports natural origin just don't respond to critics from what we can tell. So it is surprising to us. We're political scientists, and we tend to think that in our discipline, actually, when it's suggested that people have engaged in misconduct or not being completely frank about the data and so on, there has been accountability. And we're a bit surprised that the standards in public health and science related to public health and so on, there seems to be less room for internal criticism and openness to criticism within the profession. And that's just something that surprised us as we've gotten into this.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about and write about your sense of risk in even tackling this issue, which is a bad and scary thing.
I mean, we saw many people over the course of the pandemic who raised questions come in for reputational attacks. I mean, everyone involved with the Great Barrington Declaration experienced that. Or you have Brown economist Emily Oster, who collected data on the effects of school reopening, and just harsh attacks leveled at her.
Yeah.
Or you mentioned
death threats. I mean, I've had her on the show a couple times. She even wrote an article for The Atlantic saying, "Can't we just declare a moratorium on the harsh rhetoric?" Not even saying I was right. No, this was not allowed. She got more death threats based on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been a dangerous area to work in. And so we were expecting, as we brought the book out, just to get, enormous blowback. And instead, what we've gotten is a pretty respectful hearing. It's been a much better experience than we were anticipating. This is one where, Steve and I, as collaborators, Steve had a more optimistic view of what the potential for this project was. But I had watched what had happened with others who had raised questions, and I had my doubts.
Well, he's the theorist and you're the empiricist, so that makes sense.
That's right. I have a sunnier view. But we've been, the PBS NewsHour had us on, and William Wrangham was terrific. He'd read the book, and, it seemed to register with him deeply. We cited the New York Times and other places. So it may be that at the 5-year mark here, we're entering a period where people are willing to engage in more of a re-examination. We certainly see that students, having lived through this as high school students and college students, suffered a kind of trauma that they probably would benefit from acknowledging and having discussed. And certainly, I think at a time when, we did have worries about, we're releasing this book at a time when the science is being attacked and defunded, and the universities are being attacked and defunded, and so on. And, our hope is that a frank reckoning and being willingness to acknowledge mistakes from our own tribe, as it were, educated elites, will be good for the health of these institutions, that we're better off admitting mistakes where they took place. And so far, we feel that we've been treated pretty fairly for the most part.
Yeah, I will note that on The Daily, and Michael Barbara did a typical thorough interview. The title was, "Were the COVID lockdowns worth it?" When, of course, your book clearly argues the COVID lockdowns were not worth it. And I just suspected that had they titled the episode that, it would anger their listeners or maybe people in the organization a little too much. I want to ask you one last thing, which is about the day we're speaking. Harvard has just rejected the Trump administration's demand that they have forced viewpoint diversity. But what the book argues for, and in fact, from what I know of how the book originated, which was, Stephen, you were contemplating all these areas in academia without viewpoint diversity to the detriment of the Democratic Party, not understanding things like immigration or abortion or where Republicans stood on that or the good points they made. But what would you say? I'm going to assume you don't think by government diktat we should have forced viewpoint diversity, but would you say it's an inevitable outcome of operating with blinders on? You are, to paraphrase David Frum on immigration, if the Democrats or if liberals don't get it right, then the fascists will?
Right. At this time when universities and science is being attacked, we need to make sure that our own houses are in the best possible order. And I think I felt for a while, I think Francis does too, that we're alienated from society in a way because we don't represent important parts of society. We don't have represented in our ranks nearly enough important parts of society. We're not asking questions that ordinary people have. And yes, I started out thinking about immigration as another issue where I think progressives have often not paid enough attention to the interests of working class people and the grievances about these matters and some other matters as well. So I do think greater viewpoint diversity would be good for universities. It should not be forced on universities by the government. But I would hope that that universities embrace that value and try to address it in the future.
I teach in a policy school, and we have students who want to go out and work in policy-related fields. And in order for them to be prepared to do that, they need to encounter the full range of arguments that exist in society, arguments and analyses that exist in society. And academic settings are just not doing a good enough job at that, in my view.
Yes, I agree.
Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee are professors at Princeton University. They are the authors of In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us. And I hope you got from this conversation how enormously beneficial and important I think this book is. Thank you both very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Mike.
you.
Thank you so much.